How do the wines of the Languedoc region of southern France differ from neighbouring Roussillon? How have the wines of the Languedoc evolved since the 1970s? And what makes the Languedoc particularly well-suited for organic viticulture? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions during our chat with Rosemary George, author of the terrific book, Wines of the Languedoc. By the end of our conversation, you'll also discover what it was like becoming one of the first women to earn a Master of Wine designation, how Rosemary's journey into wine writing began, what inspired Rosemary's initial fascination with the Languedoc region, what you need to know about the Languedoc region in terms of geography and how it fits into the bigger picture of French wine, how Rosemary's book, The Wines of the Languedoc, compares and differs to other books about the region, how does Garrigue influence Languedoc wines, and hey, what is Garrigue? How does the Languedoc's maritime climate compare to other wine regions in France? Who are some of the more interesting winemakers that Rosemary has met in the region? And how are Languedoc winemakers responding to new challenges due to climate change? Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 324. Recently, I've been interviewed on CTV National News, BNN, Bloomberg, and others about possible tariffs on U.S. wines and spirits in response to U.S. tariffs. I should say that I'm recording this on February 2nd, and I hope it doesn't happen at all. As I discussed on CTV News Montreal, I see this as an opportunity to expand sales of Canadian wines, ciders, and spirits, and I do not mean this in a protectionist way. Quebec's SAQ stores, for example, sell almost 90% imported wines and spirits. Of the 10% that's either made in Canada or bottled here, the latter being blends of Canadian and international grapes, only 0.4% are VQA wines made in this country. There's definitely an unmet demand, given the large percentage of wine tourism, both in Quebec and to Ontario, that is from Quebec residents. And I'll bet Ontario residents also account for a large number of tourists to Quebec as well. Not only could the SAQ, LCBO, and other liquor boards across the country take this opportunity to increase choice on the shelves, but they could also implement the successful direct-to-consumer model that British Columbia and Alberta recently legalized, where the two provinces are now shipping product directly to consumers across their borders. I'd love to see that, especially since the wines made in each province are so different from each other, and the beauty of wine is in its wild diversity of taste. Every bottle of 100% Canadian wine or spirits contributes $90 to our economy versus just $16 for an imported bottle, injecting more than $20 billion every year and creating 85,000 jobs, often in rural areas on family-run farms, and of course, all the spin-off businesses like tourism and hotels and travel and so on. In a time of economic uncertainty, there's no reason not to open our own interprovincial borders. Come on, people, to strengthen our economy and to increase the incredible range of flavors that makes wine so exciting. Meanwhile, I'm reviewing my favorite wines on Instagram at Natalie McLean Wine. Connect with me there. Back to today's guest. 2 of you will win copies of Rosemary's beautiful book, The Wines of Languedoc. All you have to do is email me and let me know that you'd like to win. I'll choose 2 winners randomly from those who contact me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. I'm announcing 2 winners of the Wines of Greece book by Konstantinos Lazakaris, who was our guest last week, so drum roll. Congratulations to Rocco Fasano, of Maple, Ontario, and to Julien Augereau, who splits his time between Taiwan and Bordeaux. We also have one final winner of the book, Press for Champagne, and it's Matthew Germain from Montreal. In other bookish news, if you're reading the paperback or ebook or listening to the audiobook of my memoir, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much, a national bestseller and one of Amazon's best books of the year, I'd love to hear from you at natalie@nataliemclean.com. I'd be happy to send you beautifully designed, personally signed book plates for the copies you buy or give as gifts. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemclean.com/324. The paperback usually arrives within a day or two of ordering, and the ebook and audiobook are instantly available. Okay, on with the show. Rosemary George has been in the wine industry for 52 years. She passed the prestigious Master of Wine exam in 1979, making her one of the first women to do so. In 1981, she started writing about wine as a freelancer and has subsequently authored 14 books, including those on New Zealand, Tuscany, Chablis, Fougères, the Languedoc, and Roussillon. And she joins us now from her home in London, England. Welcome, Rosemary. We're so glad you could be here with us.
Great to be here, Natalie. Nice to meet you online.
Yeah, exactly. This is how most of us meet these days, it seems.
It's good to put the face to the name,
Exactly. So first, before we dive into the Languedoc, as one of the first women in the world to become a Master of Wine, how did that shape your perspective on the wine industry, or how you wrote about it, or any other aspect you want to mention?
I fell into the wine trade as a secretary, lured into the wine trade by an offer of a job as a secretary, plus a glass of the Wine Society champagne. They're the largest, longest, oldest mail order company, well, it was mail order company, obviously now email company in England. And I'd been an enthusiastic member of London University's Wine Society. So wine seemed to go a good career, but as a secretary, I worked out pretty quickly I was not suited to secretarial work. So the Master of Wine for me was an escape, prove yourself. And women had to prove themselves then. The wine trade was very male-dominated back in the 70s.
Right, absolutely. And that's quite the way to prove yourself. As we know, the pass rate for that exam is notoriously low, like 10%. It's very, very difficult.
Well, the trouble is about the exam is that you have to write as well as taste. So there are people who are good at writing essays, people who are brilliant tasters who cannot write an essay to save their lives. But see, the two skills are needed. I think that's what makes it particularly challenging. So I'd hate to be doing the exam now because you have to write a dissertation as well.
Oof. I'm sure you do well with all those books. So how did your journey into wine writing begin then?
Well, I was sacked, quite simply.
Okay.
Before it was
that'll do
made redundant. I worked for a small one-man band wine merchant, and he realised quite quickly I was not what he needed, and he was quite right. And 30 years old, I did admit to him that sacking me was the best career move I ever made, because that's what led to writing. I thought, I'll get another job, but I didn't. But I got a book contract with 2 phone calls.
Wow, that's extraordinary.
The really good thing that happened was that the first time my husband was made redundant from the city, it's very civilised, sent off to do, see a placements agent, he helped you plan your career. And this woman who became a great friend did the psychometric assessments on Christopher, and he very cheekily said, could Rosemary come and see you too? I walk in to see her, we've not met before. I've hardly sat down before she says to me, the first thing I have to say, don't ever get another office job ever again. You're a complete disaster in office. I went, wow, a license to play.
I often say I'm too feral for an office. I could never work.
Exactly. I couldn't believe it, just from ticking these boxes. And then she went on to say that I actually had a very good profile for a self-employed person because I was highly motivated and responded to deadlines. And then that I was not especially imaginative. So, I haven't got a novel in my head, but I'm quite creative. So I can write about something I know. So
interesting. The difference between creative and imaginative. Yeah.
Yes, it's quite interesting. Yes, it's a difference of. So that's kind of how it all happened, really.
Well, great. And so I know you've written other books, but what prompted your initial fascination with the Languedoc region? And maybe paint a picture for us as to where you were, what triggered the idea for this book.
My first book, Chablis, was published, and I wrote the launch party. Julian Jeffs, who was the QC, or now KC, comes up to me and asks me legally phrased questions about how he's going to be spending the next few months, years, whatever. And he said, I'll come clean. I would like you to write French country wines for Faber and Faber. Prestigious publishers, Yes, Elliot. And I thought, oh, wow. So, of course, immediately I said yes, not thinking that French country wines actually entailed a hell of a lot of France. It's everything that wasn't Bordeaux, Burgundy, Loire, Champagne, and the Rhone. And of course, the Languedoc formed a large part of that. So I was going to the Languedoc at the end of the 1980s when things were starting to happen. It was very much dominated by cooperatives still at that time.
And by cooperatives, so many growers contributing to a centralized winery facility.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, it's very much that system. But there were some, interesting individual wine growers. And I can remember actually the last meeting I had for French country wines, and I was about to get the night train from Narbonne to Paris. So I had lunch with a woman called Claude Viellard, who at that stage she was the export director for Vignon Val d'Aubieux, large group of cooperatives and in the Languedoc. And we actually talked about the fact there was a book to be written. But then there was a bit of a pause. I got around to doing that, which was French, the wines of the south of France, which are Bagnols to Belly. So from the first vineyard in France after Spain and the last vineyard before you go into Italy. And then, so that's really what led to my real interest in the Languedoc, was researching that, and also led to us buying a house there.
Absolutely. That's a huge area. Like, draw us a map visually. Like, how big is it compared to other French regions? Where is it on the map in southern France?
So Alice, we're going to be precisely the Languedoc. So French country wines covered Roussillon and Provence as well. So a few years later, I wrote the Languedoc. So that starts, it's the 3 department of the Aude, the Airo, and part of the Gard. So city-wise, you're going from Carcassonne in the west through to Nîmes in the east. So it's a kind of amphitheatre of the middle of France and the Mediterranean coast, where the main cities would be Carcassonne, Narbonne, Béziers, Montpellier, and then Nîmes. I'm going to say it's at least 200,000 hectares, but it is declining. It is huge. I mean, they say, it's larger than Bordeaux, it's larger than Australia, it's larger than umpteen other countries' total production.
Oh, my goodness. Wow.
And with a sort of significant quality range, and there's a very big...
Right.
There's top quality and very basic.
And we're going to get into that for sure, the changes and so on. So can you recount one really memorable experience from your early visits to the Languedoc?
I suppose early visits, what actually stands out? Well, I suppose going to see Master Domas Gassac, which was one of the pioneers. I mean, Aimé Guibert bought this property as a holiday house and then was told he got fantastic soil, and being Aimé, he thought, got to do something about this. And he had the chutzpah to ask a price that was higher than any of the other wines. And in a restaurant wine list, you kind of saw Master Domas Gassac about 10 times more expensive than anybody else, and think, wow, why? But you could understand, he was making a statement saying these wines are of great quality, which they were. And he was a little pioneer. I have a memory of tasting with Georges Bertrand, who was Gérard Bertrand's father. And he was one of the pioneers of putting wine in barrel.
Oh,
and he gave me a vertical tasting of 10 vintages of his Corbière from 1978 to 1988.
Wow. What did they do before then if they weren't barreling it?
Well, they had the very large barrels. That's what they call the foudre, which are really... Or, you've got cement vats, steel, fiberglass, whatever. But actually, for the Languedoc, to put wine in a barrel, that was quite pioneering in the late 80s. So actually, Gérard took over very suddenly. He made his name as, first of all, he was an international rugby player.
Yeah, he'd be a fascinating person.
Yeah, when you think now, and he's gone on to be one of the sort of key people in the Languedoc.
Absolutely, and I was just talking about his wine for something else I was doing, and over the past 20 years, he's converted all 17 estates to biodynamic farming, so, way beyond organic. That is incredible. It's an expensive process, it's time-consuming, but that's an amazing feat for such a large collection of wineries under his umbrella to all be biodynamic.
The Languedoc does have a lot of advantages for organic viticulture because you have the winds. So if it rains, the winds dry everything up pretty quickly.
Dry the grapes so that there's less rot or less risk.
Or dry the leaves. So the rot is not usually a problem in the Languedoc. Having said that, it can be because I think the vintages are becoming more irregular than they were, but... Certainly, it's a hell of a lot easier to be organic in the Languedoc than it is, say, Chablis.
Okay. And the winds, is the Mistral one of them? The big wind?
It's a Mistral, it's a Tramontane. It's a drying north wind. Then you get the vent marin, the sea winds, and those are the ones that bring humidity. But normally, it's a north wind that's dry.
Yeah, I've heard the Mistral can drive people crazy. It's so relentless. It just
Yes, they always say this about the Aude department. It's windier in the Aude than in the Hérault. And then you get down into the Pyrénées-Orientales of Roussillon, it's even windier.
Oh, wow.
And it really can, the winds can be very fierce.
Okay, okay.
200 kilometres an hour is not unknown.
And so tell us in a nutshell what this book is about and what makes it different from, say, other books, if they exist, on the Languedoc.
So my starting point was really, having written about the south of France at the end of the last century, I wanted to concentrate on the Languedoc, what's happening in this century. So I wrote about quite a lot of the new producers who had happened, who have set up since, to say, 2000. I cover the whole of the Languedoc, and that goes from Malpère, Cabadès, and Limoux, which are all around Carcassonne. And that's where the Languedoc is actually very precisely defined. Then as you move west, you get to Nîmes, it becomes much more blurred, because you've got Costières de Nîmes, are actually part of the Rhône Valley, but you've got Pays de Cévennes, which is in the Languedoc, whereas the parallel appellation Duché-d'Uzès is part of the Rhône Valley administratively, so that's all a bit blurred. But for me, the heart of the Languedoc is, if you like, Corbière-Minervois, Fougères-Saint-Chinion, Pic-Saint-Loup, and the vineyards around Montpellier.
Right, those are important appellations. What makes them...
And that's another good one that shouldn't be forgotten.
Okay, and what makes them so important to the Languedoc? Is it because where they are geographically? Is it because the wines are really representative of the Languedoc as a whole?
They're representative of the Languedoc. They use the classic grape varieties of the Languedoc and come up with spicy Languedoc flavours, and they are the heart of the Languedoc.
And the classic grapes being Carignan and...
Well, for red wine, you've got Grenache, Mourvèdre, Syrah, Carignan, and Cinsault.
Okay, big reds.
And then white wines is a bit more variety, yes. But the Syrah and Mourvèdre were grape varieties that were planted in the 70s, 80s as what they called the cépage améliorateur, the improving grape varieties. It was thought that the Carignan needed to have something else added to it. Now I think there's a trend, people realise how good Carignan is, especially in sort of, with climate change coming into effect, that it actually does very well. If it's treated properly in the vineyard and the yields are not too high, it will make some really good wine.
How would you describe typical Carignan? You said spicy?
Yes, I think there's a little bit of spice, a bit of red fruit. There's a bit of freshness. There's some acidity and as well as tannin and some freshness.
And how do you define freshness? That's a word I hear a lot, and I like it, but I find it like people have different definitions.
I think to me it's a lift on the finish, and it leaves you wanting another glass or another taste. How about that?
Well, a lot of wines do that. I don't know if they're all fresh for me, but I'll have more of that.
Wine finish is if it's heavy,
right,
you're less charmed by it.
Okay. Oh, that's a good definition. And you also talk very evocatively about garrigue.
Well, the garrigue, yes.
Tell us what that is and how it comes through.
Well, the garrigue is the scrubland of the shrubs of the Languedoc. So it's herbs, it's things like rosemary, juniper, thyme. It's lots of sort of small vegetation. A lot of in sisters. In May, you will get the hillsides will be flower with lots of sisters. And they're plants with quite a lot of scent, and so those kind of find their way into, I think, in my mind, into the wines of the Languedoc. And with the warm sunshine, of course, it's quite the smells come off.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. And how does the Languedoc's sort of maritime climate compare to inland areas? How does that affect?
Well, you've got the coastal plains, which of course were developed very much when phylloxera hit, and they were trying, perhaps, there was sort of flood irrigation to try and kill off the phylloxera louse, and of course, it's easy cultivation. So with that, a lot of the vineyards on the higher up altitude were given up, and now, of course, there's a trend of moving back up into the hills, which is where the appellation Terrasse du Larzac comes into play, because that was it's a new appellation which includes villages that in 1985, when the Côte du Languedoc appellation was created, they were deemed to be too cool. Now, of course, with people looking for freshness, you want cooler climate. And the same you could say about Pic Saint-Loup again. It's one of the cooler, more northern bits of the Languedoc.
And now they're coming into their own as things warm up. Terrasses, I've heard that. Does that mean terraces or?
Terrace, yes.
Terraces. Okay, because vineyards are often planted on terraced vineyards, like graduated.
I mean, there probably were the remains of old terrace vineyards, and a lot of those terraces have probably disappeared.
Okay. So how would you define the Languedoc's identity compared to Roussillon? They're often grouped together.
They are completely different, because Roussillon was part of Spain until the Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659. And the Languedoc is French. I mean, Roussillon speaks Catalan. They see themselves as Northern Catalonia. That the Pyrenees for Roussillon is a unifying thing. It does not divide them from Spain. It unites them. Whereas Languedoc speaks Occitan, and it has a different history. And the wine, because the key grape variety of Roussillon is Grenache, and that was also used for Vin doux naturel. There's very much a tradition for Vin doux in Roussillon, which you have very much less in the Languedoc.
And Vin doux is what, for those who don't know?
It's the fortified wines that like Banyuls and Maury and Rivesaltes.
Okay.
The wonderful wines. If you don't know about those, they're the ones that matured in barrel and last for years. Old, Rivesaltes, delicious, one of the great wines of the world, and totally underappreciated. Whereas the Languedoc doesn't have that tradition to the same extent.
Okay. Roussillon, I've got to remember how to pronounce that because it has two L's in it, but we don't say the L's, obviously.
I've just come back from Argentina where they say double L. I was suddenly this new grape variety, Semillon, as opposed to Semillon.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Double L's can be pronounced in different ways.
It's good to know, especially if you want to say it correctly in a restaurant. And how would the wines of the Languedoc differ from, say, other Mediterranean wine regions along southern Italy and Spain?
I think completely different grape varieties.
Okay.
So having said that, of course, Grenache and Carignan come up, their origins are Spanish. I suppose it's climate. The one link with it, Mediterranean Italy would be Vermentino, or Roll as you're supposed to call it in France.
Okay, and that's a white grape, right?
That's a white grape variety. But southern Italy, it's things like Nero d'Avola and Primitivo and things was...
Right, yeah, from the islands.
I would think also probably, I think it says Spain as being probably richer, more alcohol. If you think like Priorat is more oak, perhaps.
Stronger oak aging tradition for sure in Spain.
I don't really know very much about Spain, I have to say, so I'm probably going to say...
You're staying in your lane. No problem. Share with us maybe one of the most interesting winemakers you met in the region.
There's a lovely woman in Fougères, Catherine Rock, but she's a great friend. But I remember the first time I went to see her, it was really funny. First of all, my surname is George. She kind of got a bit confused. The French don't think George is some man. She thought she was going to be seeing a bloke, and she thought she was going to get rid of him in 10 minutes. I was still there 2 hours later.
And thus you are friends.
And she was doing all sorts of things. I mean, she had not yet got her Fougères vineyard. She's now very much settled in Fougères. And her daughter has taken over the vineyard that's the other side of the hills from Fougères, and in the Haute Valley de l'Aude. So she was making some delicious Pinot Noir, which is a great variety you don't find commonly in the Languedoc because it's too hot. And she also had some Petit Arvin, a little bit of Riesling, and just she's a very thoughtful winemaker. And it was a brilliant afternoon.
And again, just sort of defining, is Fougères neighbouring to Languedoc or part of the Languedoc?
Fougères is certainly part of the Languedoc. I'm very enthusiastic about Fougères because my French home is 2 villages away.
Yeah, it's your second home, right? You live there part of the year?
Well, with Brexit, it's a bit complicated, but say 2-3 months of the year, possibly.
Right. It must have been a strong advantage to you in writing about the region to have a home there.
We just sort of discovered the region very much when I was writing the wines of the south of France, because in the course of that we were saying, from Draguignan in Provence around to Perpignan, and then we focused on the fact that the area we really liked was Pézenas, Clermont-Lérault, which is sort of Fougères, Saint-Chinian wine-wise.
Okay.
Because we thought about perhaps going a house outside London. If you wake up in London, it's pouring with rain. It's going to be pouring with rain in Sussex. But if you get on a plane to Montpellier, hour and a half flying time as opposed to an hour and a half driving time, the weather's likely to be better. Not always, but likely to be.
Oh, that's optimistic. That's great. I'd move there too if I could. Was there one particularly challenging interview that you did while you were writing the book, researching it?
I think most of the Languedoc wine growers are very happy to talk. The one problem I had, I would have loved to have interviewed Laurent Vaillet from La Grange des Pères, but he just never responded to interview requests.
Is he famous in the region? Why did you want to interview him?
Yes, now he's died, but he was very famous. He was one of the pioneers, neighbour of Master Mascassac, but he was rather reclusive and just. I had seen him earlier, but this time it just silence.
Yeah. Well, I know what you're talking about. Is some winemakers just don't come out of their cave.
Yes, most do, I think. If they decided they're sort of serious and
Yeah. Now, you've mentioned climate change a few times. Things are warming up around the globe. How are winemakers in the Languedoc responding to that challenge? What are they doing? What are they changing?
I think there's research on different grape varieties. I mean, that Syrah was introduced as a cépage améliorateur, but actually Syrah in very hot weather doesn't actually perform that well. It gets rather sort of too bit ripe and jammy and sort of a bit too tapenade, black olive sort of characters. So I think one of the source of experimentation is what other grape varieties might they, and also the realization that actually Carignan and Cinsault do actually work rather well in the Languedoc. I think with climate change, not necessarily, yes, it's getting hotter. I mean, Roussillon is the area that's really suffered from lack of water this year. The Languedoc's not been so bad. You could irrigate on the plains, but the hillside vineyards, it's too steep to irrigate. And in any case, there's no water available. I think the other thing is that the weather is actually less regular. Once upon a time, at school I was taught Mediterranean climate was hot, dry summers, mild, wet winters. The Languedoc could expect a storm amongst the two bank holidays of the summer, so the 14th of July and the 15th of August. There was likely to be, a bit of a downpour, and that would refresh everything. But these days, that doesn't always happen. No, and this year has actually been quite complicated because the weather was a bit cool in September, so they've had rather a drawn-out harvest, waiting for things to ripen, and then, some drought earlier in the year. So it's... And then, they have had frost. I go to Chablis quite frequently. I've written a lot about Chablis, but the one time I've actually seen frost-damaged vineyards was in the Languedoc, and I'm out walking. I knew the temperature had dropped the previous night. And I thought, what are all these sort of burnt brown leaves? And that's realised frost. A line that one side of the road had been frosted and the other hadn't. And it's a horrible sight to see. And there are other hazards, of course, hailstorms, which again is a horrible thing to see in a vineyard that looks as though a troop of goats has gone through. But actually it's hail, and it's everything, all sort of leaves and twigs on the ground.
Yeah, they're saying it's global weirding now, like just these weird episodes of...
I think it's just warming. I think in London our rain is much heavier than it used to be, for instance. It's those sort of changes, more erratic.
Absolutely. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Rosemary. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, how do the wines of the Languedoc region of southern France differ from neighbouring Roussillon? The two regions are completely different, Rosemary observes, because Roussillon was part of Spain until the Treaty of the Pyrenees. They see themselves as part of northern Catalonia. The Pyrenees, those mountains for Roussillon, are actually a unifying thing, and it does not divide them for Spain, at least in their minds. It unites them. Whereas Languedoc speaks Occitan and has a different history. The wine also makes them different because the key grape variety of Roussillon is Grenache, and that was also used for vin doux naturel, the fortified wines like Banyuls, Morey, Rivesaltes. They're matured in barrel and last for years. Rosemary is a huge fan of them, and they're one of the great wines of the world, she says, totally underappreciated. The Languedoc doesn't have that tradition to the same extent. Number 2, what makes Languedoc particularly well-suited for organic viticulture? As Rosemary notes, the Languedoc has a lot of advantages for organic viticulture, especially because of the winds. So if it rains, the winds dry up everything pretty quickly, and of course grapes rot when there's moisture between them. Rot is usually not a problem in this region, and she adds that vintages, though, are becoming more irregular than they were, but it's certainly still a lot easier to be organic in Languedoc than, say, in northern regions of France like Chablis. And number 3, how have the wines of the Languedoc evolved since the 70s? For red wine, Rosemary says you have Grenache, Mourvedre, Syrah, Carignan, and Cinsault. Syrah and Mourvedre were grape varieties that were planted only in the 1970s or 80s. It's what they called cépage améliorateur, the improving grape varieties. It was thought that Carignan needed to have something else added to it. Now, I think there's a trend, she says, because people realize just how good Carignan is on its own, especially with climate change coming into effect. It will make some really good wine, she says. There's a bit of spice, red fruit, freshness, and some acidity, as well as balancing tannin. In the show notes, you'll find a full transcript of my conversation with Rosemary, links to her website and books, the video versions of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online now, no matter where you live. If you missed episode 10, go back and take a listen. I chat about wines for seduction, a vine romance for Valentine's Day. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite. The research firm CyberPulse found that 59% of women ages 21 to 39 wish their sweethearts would give them wine, not candy, on Valentine's Day. And London, UK's Sunday Times reported that wine tastings rank above all other venues for finding a date. The reason? Wine means spending time together. In fact, I can't think of an unromantic wine. However, when it comes to choosing the wines to celebrate Valentine's Day, there are certain bottles that hold a special place in my heart. These are delicious wines that I can depend on year after year. And dependability and loyalty count for a lot when it comes to both wine and love. You won't want to miss next week when we continue our chat with Rosemary. Same bat time, same bat channel. If you liked this episode or learned even one teensy tiny thing from it, please email or tell one friend about the podcast this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in learning more about the wines from Languedoc. It's easy to find my podcast. Just tell them to search for Natalie MacLean Wine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, their favorite podcast app, or they can listen to the show on my website at nataliemaclean.com/podcast. Email me if you have a sip, tip, question, or would like to win one of 2 copies of Rosemary's book, or if you've read mine or are listening to it. I'd also love to hear your thoughts about this episode. Were you surprised about Languedoc wines? Have you tried them? Do you have a favorite one? Email me at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. In the show notes, you'll find a link to take a free online food and wine pairing class with me called The 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever at nataliemaclean.com/class. And that's all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/324. So glad we're coming to the end because I'm almost losing my voice here. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass. Perhaps, let me think about it, a wine from the Languedoc. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemaclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.